Okay, so today I will be talking about a project that I just participated on, it's connected to my historical research. So I've been doing research on the history of computer games in 1980s Czechoslovakia, me and my colleague and friend Martin Kouba took some of these games and we converted them so that they are playable on the web by today's audiences. And I'll be talking about this project. I will tell you also a bit about those games as well, but this is more about how we made the remakes, how we made the conversions, than the games themselves. But if you're interested in reading about the games and about the gaming community in the 1980s and the whole history, you can read this book, Gaming the Iron Curtain, which came out 2 years ago with MIT Press. And there is this whole chapter about activist games, chapter 7, Empowered by Games. Games as a means of self-expression and activism, and it talks a lot about media participation, basically, about how computer games were used as a means of participation, media participation in the 1980s in Czechoslovakia. I'm giving various examples in that chapter of games that were about people's personal stories or games that somehow express their political opinions. But unfortunately, when you're reading the book, you cannot really play the games. So you kind of have to take my word for it. So I've always wanted to make these games more accessible. So these games have been preserved. You can play them, but there are several obstacles. So they're in Czech or Slovak. So if you don't read that language, you cannot really play them. Most of them are text-based games. There's a lot of text. You wouldn't be able to play them. The interface is very dated. These are games from the 80s, and it's hard to control them, like for today's audiences. And also, if you want to play the original digitized versions of those games, you need special software. And it's possible, but it's just hard to set it up for the general audience. So I'd always wanted to make these games more accessible. And that's why we finally found an excuse in this exhibition. That was an exhibition commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, and this is actually very topical because earlier this week we celebrated this 31st anniversary, the Academy of Sciences of the Czech Republic were organizing this conference, November 1989, Road to Democracy. And there's also an associated website called 100 Student Revolutions. And we were asked to sort of make these conversions for the website and for the exhibition. And now I should say that if you want to play one of those games that we've converted in English, there should be in the chat a link to one of those games. So you can play it now or later. Yeah, so we were asked to make these conversions, and we picked 3 games that we felt were very important and very significant in relation to the exhibition, which was mostly focused on sort of the DIY aspects, the participatory aspects of the Velvet Revolution. So things like student newspapers, leaflets, DIY posters, and all these things. So really just personal involvement of individual people who were protesting against the communist regime in the 80s. So we picked these amateur games made by individuals, in the 1980s, and these games were produced for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum computer, which is a British computer, but it was the most popular platform at that time in Czechoslovakia. And yeah, we picked these 3 games. There were more activist games being made, but these 3 we felt were most representative. So Reconstruction is a game from 1988, made by Miroslav Fiedler. It was a game in which the goal is to destroy a statue of Lenin. And along the way, you had to destroy different symbols of the oppressive communist regime, like lighting up Marxist capital on fire to go through like a dark corridor, things like that. And once you finish the game and solved all the puzzles, there was a message saying that congratulations, we'll all meet on Old Town Square on the 21st August of 1988, which was the anniversary of the occupation of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet troops. So it was a game that openly invited people to protest against the regime. And all of these games were text adventures. So most of the interaction is in text, and the descriptions of the locations are in text, and you control the characters by typing commands to the main character. The next game is The Adventures of Indiana Jones in Wenceslas Square in Prague on January 16th, 1989. And that takes place during a series of demonstrations in January 1989. And the main character here is Indiana Jones, who was at that time a popular character in Czechoslovak computer games. Of course, all of them were unlicensed, but yeah, Indiana Jones just appeared in a lot of games. And in this particular game, the goal was to basically survive the turmoil on Wenceslas Square when the demonstrations were brutally suppressed by the police, and you had to kind of run away from tear gas and basically get into combat with policemen and militiamen. It was a very brutal game, which kind of gave players the chance to relive this traumatic experience from the point of view of an action hero, in a way. In this case, we don't know who wrote the game. It was released anonymously, and I haven't been able to track down the author. And the third one is just simply called 17th of November 1989, and it's a game that recreates the events of police violence on Národní Třída Boulevard, which was basically like the main event that triggered the events of the Velvet Revolution. And in this game, the goal is to find video recording equipment and film evidence of police brutality. And I think it resonates with the topic of the exhibition very well, because it ties to these sort of amateur video recordings that were circulating at that time. And this is a game about acquiring that recording, making that recording. So these were the three games. We got permission to make the conversion of reconstruction. In the rest of the cases, we don't know the author, so we don't have permission. But we hope if they come forward that they will give us the permission retroactively, I would say. Also, I have to say that the two images on the left, reconstruction and Indiana Jones, these are actually not the original images from the original games. These were made for the conversions. Okay, so how do we go about it? How do we make these games, which are fascinating? How do we make them accessible to today's audience? And there's a lot of theory about it. I'll be very fast. I mean, people definitely agree that there's not just one right way of doing that. There's no one authentic version of a game that needs to be exhibited. And chasing the original experience is not very useful. So, do you really need to have the original hardware? Do you really need to have Sinclair ZX Spectrums exhibited at that exhibition? Very often people just break those machines, and the machines are just very low quality, and they the game keeps crashing and so on. So probably that's not the best choice. And our goal was not to exhibit hardware from the period, but to kind of facilitate that experience of playing the game and facilitate the content of those games. So bringing games to non-games exhibition to the general public and present them as part of the DIY media landscape. So what are the options then? So we could have used original hardware, which is just generally not a very good idea because it breaks down. We could use emulation, specialized software that just takes the original software and just plays it for you in a window on your PC or Mac. But then we wouldn't really solve the problem with the dated interface and with the language, right? So we didn't do that. We picked a more complicated way, of course. So we decided to take these games and create web conversions so that these games are playable online on the web, which is, I guess, the most accessible platform that there is today. And what we did was, we had to go through all these steps. So we had to analyze the code, we created our own engine, well, it was mostly Martin. I was a producer, he's the programmer. So I was the producer, designer, and kind of manager of the project, and he was the programmer. So the props should go to him for the fact that it works. So we created the engine, and then we rebuilt those games in that engine, and we tested it, and then we presented it. There's some technical stuff that might not be very interesting for many of you, but if you are, I can talk a bit more about it in the Q&A. But basically, we took the preserved code, which was digitized from cassette tapes by fans. So there are fan archives of games from the 80s. So we took the code. It was in various programming languages and types of code. And then we basically analyzed it as well as we could. And we looked at how these games work, what the mechanics are, what the basic rules of those games are. We basically recreated or reverse engineered a design document for these games, including the data about the locations present in the game, you know, the various rooms. In Indiana Jones game, you know, there are different locations in Wenceslas Square that you can go through, and there are different items in those locations. And we just made a list of all these. We basically recreated the database. And we also took the in-game text from the original. We also found some surprises, like hidden messages in the code of the game. In one of the games, you could read a message to, you know, a hacker, like anybody who would want to read the code. I'm sorry. Stop right there. Such cheating is not befitting the morals of a socialist citizen. So they're basically asking you to not read the code, but we read it anyway. So once we kind of we knew what the basic functionality of these games is, we created the engine, and then we rebuilt those games in that engine. When doing that, we kind of had to balance, I think this is probably the most interesting part of the presentation, at least for me, we had to balance accuracy and usability. So we wanted to kind of deliver, to some extent, the original experience of playing the game and the content, but at the same time, we wanted to make it more accessible. So how do we go about it? So first, we decided that we really want to preserve the content and style of those games. So there was a suggestion from one of the curators of the exhibition. So why don't you make it into a point-and-click adventure game with graphics? And we thought that would just change the game too much. We wanted to give people access to this game as a historical artifact of sorts. So we didn't do that. So we maintained the genre, the type of representation. We reproduced all the events and puzzles from the original game. So, you know, you still have to put the copy of Marx's Capital on fire in our game, but also we had to replicate all the game over scenes and death scenes. So in the Indiana Jones game, it kind of makes a point about police brutality on Wenceslas Square during those demonstrations. And you will die a lot in that game, and you can try it for yourselves. You will die a lot. And we had to reproduce all these deaths and all these game over states very closely. We copied all the in-game text from the originals. We recreated the aesthetic of the original game, so it's also in text. We even sampled the sound effects from the originals. But at the same time, we made some usability improvements. We improved the parsers, which means that now when you type the commands for the characters, so you would type something like, go west, take the axe, for example, as a weapon against the policeman. Originally, the parser would be very rigid. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to type pick up the axe instead of take the axe. And we enabled people to use these synonyms. We enabled shortening of words and so on. We enabled saving and loading one's game, which makes the games arguably easier, but we don't think it's that much of a big deal. We created a hint system. The games are pretty hard. So if you get lost, if you get stuck, you can use this hint system to kind of get some tips. We commissioned intro graphics for 2 of the games that didn't have any, so that they have some kind of visual identity. We commissioned it from the pixel artist and illustrator Jana Kilianova from Brno. We used a more readable font than the original ones. And we also added instructions. So if you open the game, you will see that there's like a question mark. icon in the top right where you can click and you'll read more about the context of the game, who made it, what's behind the game, how can you finish the game, how you can control the game, and so on. And we also provided a walkthrough, so actually you can just read, line by line how you should finish the game. So we want people to be able to finish the game, even though it is difficult. Here are some comparison screenshots, so you can see the originals on the left and the conversions on the right, and these are from the Czech versions, and you can see it's pretty similar. Yeah, so then we did some testing and polishing, and we made it on time, and the games were presented at the exhibition at the Academy of Sciences, and they're also still up on the website. And the reception has been unanimously positive. And it seems the curators didn't really collect systematic feedback, but it seems that the games were one of the attractions of the exhibition, and they now still remain on the website. And they are the most visited, the most frequently visited page from the whole website. And the website is great. It has so much stuff, interviews, oral history interviews, and like lots of great resources. So we're very proud that our games are the most popular page. It didn't stop there. We actually started to kind of adjust the engine so that we can create translations of those games. So first into English, of course, but we can do other languages as well. We had to make some engine adjustments, and we had to kind of write more extensive instructions. So for a foreign player, you might need to add information about what is Wenceslas Square, what's the shape of Wenceslas Square. It's actually quite important to know. Why Wenceslas Square, right? So all these things you can read in the instructions, so that the game is more accessible to the international audience. So this is the last slide. So this, making conversions of 1980s games is, for today's platforms, is not very common in terms of how game exhibitions usually are. But we thought that this was the best way to go for us, because web technology that we chose as our target platform has no requirements for special software. Anybody can play these games on a computer. Runs on most contemporary computers, not yet mobile devices, but it can be done. It's just we haven't done it yet. The interface is more user-friendly. We integrated contextual information, as I said, about Wenceslas Square and things like this. And we believe that these are very useful tools for teaching game history, but also regional history and media participation, because it says a lot about how computer games were used as a medium in the 1980s. And I haven't mentioned it before, but this is actually very exceptional. There's almost no evidence anywhere in the world from that time of computer games being used for activism. It's very exceptional. And we think that this is something that we maybe should also be proud of as people from this country, that games were used in such inventive ways here in the 1980s. At the same time, this was pretty hard to do and pretty time consuming to actually take each of these games and kind of by hand kind of converting them, reprogramming them basically. And our engine is general to some extent, so it can eventually kind of run other games as well, but probably a narrow range of titles, and it takes a lot of work to actually make it run. So this is it's not very scalable. I think it was good for this project, but it's not very scalable. Yeah, this is that's it from me. But you can play the game and see for yourself if we did a good enough job. And like a longer version of this presentation will be published in the ROM-Chip Journal of Game Histories, and I guess in December, I think. And that's it for me. Thank you.